Hi everybody and welcome to this revision video on the ID, ego and superego. This is linked to Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality, which is linked to the topic, the psychology of the individual for stage 2 psychology. So let's get started. Okay, so this is key concept 2 of the psychodynamic theory according to Freud. So his theory has several sections. This is key concept 2. So as we can see, we've got the iceberg representation of the mind, like I talked about in a previous video on the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. But Freud later developed this theory to include the psyche having 3 interactive structures known as the ID, ego, and superego. So these structures are linked with the psyche of our iceberg. So we know that the conscious mind are thoughts we're aware of, preconscious it's just below the surface, and the unconscious is submerged deep within the sea that we should not access. So the ID, ego, and superego are also linked to different parts of our iceberg. So what we'll do in this video is talk about each of these structures and how they relate to the iceberg. So let's talk about them first and then we'll revisit the iceberg later. Okay, now the ID is referred to as the pleasure principle. Freud theorized that we are all born with the ID, or id, it's called. It doesn't matter. ID, id, it doesn't matter. All right. And it's the driver of our instinctive and primitive urges. All right. So it's our unconscious driver of our libido or a sex drive and aggression. And it is completely selfish and does not consider others. So in other words, our ID is our pleasure or selfish principle. It's very, very demanding and will want what's good at the time with absolutely no regard for any other forces, so no regard for the superego, no regard for the ego. So it is completely selfish and does not consider others. And Freud theorized that we are born with our ID, so we are born selfish. So he often would use this to explain why babies scream and demand to be fed or changed or held, because they have no they have no consideration for any other force. And then later on, we develop a conscience and we develop a reality of the situation. So the ID is often nicknamed the little devil on our shoulders. So you would have seen that in, movies and cartoons where there's the angel and the devil on the shoulder telling you what to do. The ID is similar to that of the devil on our shoulders. So to do what is selfish and what will give us instant gratification, completely disregarding anybody else. Then we have our superego. Now, this is referred to as the moral principle. So it's usually the last one to develop out of the 3 forces, and it informs us about our obligations and expectations in society. And it develops through socialization and understanding what's socially acceptable. And this provides us a sense of guilt and shame. So our superego, like I said before, just to summarize, is our moral principle. It will do what is socially right and what's morally correct. So the ID and the superego, as you can probably tell, don't get along. All right. So they don't agree and they always butt heads. So the superego, just going back to the example I used before, while the ID is the little devil on our shoulder, the superego is our angel. So telling us what we should do. What's the morally correct thing to do? So that's our superego's job. So you can see why the ID and the superego don't get along. So because of that, there is the ego. Now, Freud referred to this as the reality principle. It should develop within the first 5 years of childhood. And the ego acts as the mediator or the referee between the ID and the superego. So he theorized that the ego is responsible for the development of a balanced and healthy personality, and it should be the most dominant or the most in charge in adulthood. So a good way to use as an example for the ego is like a referee between these two, all right? So it still satisfies the ID, but doesn't upset the superego and takes reality into consideration. So it's the ego's job to keep everybody happy. By doing so, it means that our unconscious mind or our ID won't need to surface, and our superego is happy as well because we're doing the morally correct thing, but we're also taking reality into account. So it's the ego's job to keep everybody happy and mediate between the ID and the superego. And this should be the most dominant force, the ego, as we go into adulthood, according to Freud. So the ego should be the strongest in a healthy adult. It allows the needs of the ID to be met without upsetting the superego while taking reality into account. However, obviously things happen. If the ID is dominant in a person, it may result in narcissism and or the development of antisocial personality disorder. So again, those of you that did forensic and criminal psychology with me last year in year 11, we looked at antisocial personality disorder quite extensively. According to Freud, that would mean that the psychopaths or the antisocial personality disorder, the ID is dominant when it shouldn't be. However, if the superego is dominant, it makes a person more susceptible to developing depression, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, according to Freud. Now, there's obvious issues with his theory, and remember, this is just a theory, it's not proven by science. But his theory at the time of developing the psychodynamic theory was if the superego is dominant, so we are always selfless and doing the moral thing, it makes a person more depressed because we're not being selfish now and then and having our own needs met. We're constantly anxious about pleasing others and developing obsessive compulsive disorder as a result. So that's why he argued that the ego should be the strongest because it still satisfies the ID but doesn't upset the superego. So just going back to the iceberg here to finish off this revision video, Freud theorized that our ID should stay submerged with our unconscious mind, all right, or our ID is the same as our unconscious mind. The ego should be a part of our conscious and pre-conscious thoughts, same with our superego. So the ego and the superego we should be aware of, or it should just be in our pre-conscious mind, easily accessible, whereas our ID, we should grow out of it by the time we're 5 years old. And again, if the ego is the strongest, it will meet the needs of the ID so it can stay submerged underwater, but not upset our superego, all right? Because that's not ideal either, according to Freud. Okay, that's it for this revision video, Year 12s. So I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you've got questions, let me know.